daily Genesis to Revelation study. Today's two chapters are Numbers chapters 19 and 20. These are the chapters that causes Moses and Aaron not to enter the promised land. Reading from Numbers 19 verse 1. And Yahweh spoke unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which Yahweh hath commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel. I'm going to jump to verse 10. And he that gathereth the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean unto the evening. And it shall be unto the children of Israel and unto the stranger that sojourneth among them for a statute forever. And he that toucheth the dead body of any man shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with it on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day he shall be clean. But if he purifieth not himself the 3rd day, then the 7th day he shall not be clean. Whosoever toucheth the dead body of any man that is dead, and purifieth not himself, defileth the tabernacle of Yahweh, and that soul shall be cut off from Israel. Because the water of separation was not sprinkled upon him, he shall be unclean. His uncleanliness is yet upon him. Verse 20. But the man that shall be clean and shall not, but the man that shall be unclean and shall not purify himself, that soul shall be cut off from among the congregation, because he hath defiled the sanctuary of Yahweh. The water of separation hath not been sprinkled upon him, he is unclean. And whatsoever the unclean toucheth shall be unclean, and the soul that toucheth it shall be unclean until the evening. So that was the law of a red heifer. They're supposed to burn so-and-so outside the camp, and the person who did all the burning to wash his clothes and purify himself. If he didn't follow God's instructions, he will remain unclean. If he didn't do it at the appointed time, the 3rd day. That's a lesson for us on how specific the character of God is. For example, if they miss the 3rd day of verses 14 to 16, they retain their uncleanliness. Sin makes us dirty and defiled. So we note that the ordinance of the law above, to be clean and not clean, is a principle of God. But the point I wish to make here is that an ordinance, which says the ordinance of the law, is different from a law in itself. An ordinance is different to a law of God. Most people think they are the same, especially when it comes to understanding the book of Ephesians. Ephesians chapters 2:15. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make himself of twain one new man, so making peace. People are taught to think that commandments and ordinances are the same, and use it to say that the commandments have been abolished. That's what I use that verse for, or one of them. Luke chapter 1:16. Look at some uses of the word ordinance. And they were both righteous before God, talking about John the Baptist's parents, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of Yahweh blameless. So this tells us to be righteous and blameless, we have to keep both commandments and ordinances of God. 1 Corinthians chapters 11 verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. That tells us, says that believers are to keep the ordinances. So to properly understand Ephesians 2:15, we have to put all teachings on ordinance together and take Ephesians 2:15 in the context of all the teachings. So Ephesians chapter 1 verse 1. Paul, an apostle of Yeshua, by the will of God, to the saints which are at Ephesus, and to the faithful in Christ. So two groups. These saints are of Jewish heritage, who were scattered to Gentile nations. Thus they became, in a sense, Gentiles, but they are of Israel. The and are believers from the non-Jewish heritage, i.e. natural Gentiles. The now converted Israelite Jews who believe in the Messiah and are called saints are being grafted in or joined back to the already converted Jews in Jerusalem, Israel, who were not scattered and are also called saints in verse 19. So we have Judah or Jerusalem and Israel scattered. Both are saints once they come to believe. Judah were not scattered and they already had the apostles teaching them about the Messiah. And then we have the Jews, the Israelites, shall call them, in the foreign nations, also being converted to Messiah through Paul's teachings. And in addition to those, in those Gentile nations, we have the natural Gentiles also getting the message and coming to faith in Messiah. So that's why the Bible says saints and to the faithful in Christ. So Ephesians is about uniting those who were disobedient to the way of God with those who were not. Chapters 5 verse 6. Now to address which ordinances are to be kept and which are not, I shall use Colossians 2:14, which is another verse that people use to say commands are being done away with. It says, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Verse 20. Wherefore, if ye be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances? Now, if we put these in context, as we saw above, we have to Paul says keep the ordinances. We should see it refers to the ordinances of men. That's what Paul's talking about in these Colossians 2:20 so on, and not the ordinances of God, as John the Baptist's parents kept and were blameless. So Colossians 2:8 starts off the whole teaching in the context. So understand verse 20. Colossians 2:8. Beware lest any man spoil you through the philosophy and vain deceits, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. So you see the difference? There's ordinance or teachings of men, and there's ordinance and teachings of God. So hopefully we will cover this epistle more when we get to there. But in no way is Paul teaching we do not have to keep the commandments of God, as many people are wrongly taught to interpret those verses. I'll go back to Numbers chapter 8. God speaking, take the rod and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak you unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth water. And thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock. So shalt thou give the congregation their beast to drink. And Moses took the rod from before Yahweh as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock. And he said unto them, hear you, you rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock, hit it twice. And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. And Yahweh spoke unto Moses and Aaron, because you believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. So the people moaned, put pressure on Moses for water. Moses in his frustration went to God, God told him what to do. But in his frustration, he, rather than speak to the rock as God told him, he struck it. Now the people may have been thirsty, as if God doesn't know what they need. But rather than have faith in God, they start to moan. they've seen God's power before and his status. They could have just kindly asked for his help. Moses does one part of the commandment, take the rod. But the others, he took the rod and got the people together as God said, but not the other of speaking to the rock. Similar to many seekers today. As a result, regardless of the reason, i.e. stress brought on by the rebellious people, God took away his promise to Moses and Aaron of it, not of it. The promise was they would enter the promised land, but he took that away. In Numbers 27:14, the sin is called rebellion. In Deuteronomy chapters 32:51, it is called trespass. We see a similar disobedience in 1 Samuel chapters 15. In that chapter, King Saul was about to go to battle. He was getting afraid because his men were abandoning him, and he had a lot of the enemy coming against him. And he thought he was going to do a good deed to God. And he thought he obeyed God in the instructions that he was given. 1 Samuel chapters 15 verse 15. And Saul said, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto Yahweh thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. And Saul said unto Samuel, yea, I have obeyed the voice of Yahweh, and have gone the way which Yahweh sent me, and have brought Agag the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. So there King Saul thought he had done what God asked him to do. He used his own eyes, or the people, and he kept the big things, the good things, to do a sacrifice unto God. But that wasn't God's commandment. God had destroyed everything. So in other words, God saw his good deeds differently, and what he thought was a good deed. 1 Samuel chapter 15:22. And Samuel said, hath Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than a sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of Yahweh, he hath rejected thee from being king. So what do you or should you learn from that in relation to keeping God's commandments? Stubbornness, delayed obedience is called disobedience. One lesson should be not to use your own eyes, understanding, nor that of others, even of pastors. Simply obey God's commandments fully, as Joshua did. Or we can come on to Joshua, as Joshua did, and to the detail that he gives. All you're going to church, singing, praising, tithing, charitable deeds may be of no pleasure to God if it is not done as he prescribed, and especially congregating at his appointed times. Remember Matthew chapter 7:23, when those people thought they did all good deeds, and Yeshua said, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. In other words, lawlessness. Okay, Numbers chapters 20 verse 14. And Moses sent messages from Kadesh unto the king of Edom. Thus saith thy brother Israel, thou knowest all the travail that have been fallen on us. And basically Moses asks the king of Edom if they can walk through their land on their way to the promised land. But the king said, no, if you come through our land, we can't come and fight you. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau. That's why Moses is using the phrase your brother, or Israel your brother. Jacob became Israel. Jacob was a brother of Esau. Their response to their uncle's descendant, so the king of Edom, is in opposition to Esau's response when he was meeting Jacob coming back from Laban. Even though Jacob had wronged Esau and his congregation, and this congregation did nothing to the Edomites, having been in Egypt for 430 years, the king is still saying, no, you cannot come through our land. So, remember in Genesis chapter 33 verse 4, when Esau met Jacob, it says, and Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So different response. Last verse of chapter 20, verse 23 and 24. And Yahweh spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the Mount of Hor, saying, verse 24, and Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, for he shall not enter into the land which I have given unto the children of Israel, because you rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. So, we should not get God's love misinterpreted by our desire not to obey his commandments or belief about grace. If God says to stand on one leg, we are to stand on one leg. Understand? Shalom, until tomorrow.